Man is not fully conditioned and determined. He is the one who ultimately determines whether he will surrender to circumstances or not. The voice of Viktor Frankl carries across time like a quiet defiance against despair. These words were not born in comfort. They emerged in a place where the air was thick with hopelessness, where each sunrise was less a promise than a threat. And yet, Frankl's insight was not theoretical. It was lived, day after day, in the most brutal of human laboratories, the Nazi concentration camps. It is difficult, perhaps impossible, to truly imagine what it meant to wake up in Auschwitz. The world outside the barbed wire had disappeared. The past was a ghost, the future a question mark written in fading ink. All that remained was the present moment, and even that was poisoned by hunger, cold, and fear. Prisoners wore their suffering not just on their bodies, but in their eyes. It was in this environment, stripped of all external freedoms, that Frankl came to see the one freedom no one could take away: the freedom to choose one's own attitude. Before the war, Viktor Frankl was a promising young psychiatrist in Vienna. He had studied under the great minds of his time, walked the elegant streets of the city, and filled his days with intellectual pursuits. But in 1942, everything changed. He, his wife Tilly, and his parents were deported to Theresienstadt and later to Auschwitz. His medical degrees, his home, his manuscripts, every symbol of his life's work were gone in an instant. In the camps, a person's worth was reduced to a number tattooed on their arm. Frankl had a choice, though it was not the kind of choice most of us think about. He could surrender to despair, let the circumstances dictate his inner world, or he could fight, silently, internally, for meaning. That fight, invisible to the guards and the watchtowers, was more powerful than any weapon. For Frankl, survival depended not only on physical endurance, but on the ability to see purpose beyond the pain. The mornings in Auschwitz began before the sun. A sharp whistle would pierce the cold air, followed by the shuffle of hundreds of feet dragging across frozen ground. Prisoners stood in roll call for hours, their bodies trembling, their stomachs empty. Many collapsed where they stood. Those who could not rise again were left behind, their stories ending quietly in the snow. And yet Frankl noticed something remarkable. Those who could anchor themselves to a sense of purpose, however small, were more likely to endure. Some clung to the thought of reuniting with loved ones. Others found meaning in the smallest acts of kindness, sharing a crust of bread, helping a weaker prisoner stand during roll call. In his later writings, Frankl would call this the last of the human freedoms, the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. But at the time, it was not a philosophy written in a book. It was a lifeline. Every day he practiced it. When he was beaten, when his body ached from labor, when news arrived that yet another transport of prisoners had vanished, he forced himself to ask, "What is the meaning in this?" The question itself became a shield. Frankl often imagined himself standing in a warm lecture hall back in Vienna, speaking to students about the psychology of suffering. He pictured himself describing the camps in detail, not as a victim's tale, but as a lesson in resilience. That mental image was more than a fantasy. It was a deliberate act of will, a way to keep his mind alive when everything around him was dying. And in this choice, this decision not to surrender, Frankl's philosophy was born. It is tempting in our modern world to see ourselves as victims of circumstances, our jobs, our relationships, the economy, politics, the past. But Frankl's experience reveals something profoundly unsettling and empowering at the same time. Even in the absence of all external freedom, we still hold the power to choose our inner response. That truth is not easy to embrace because it means that responsibility rests with us. Frankl was not naive. He did not believe that choosing a positive attitude would magically erase suffering. He had seen too much death, too much cruelty to indulge in empty optimism. Instead, he saw meaning as a bridge, a way to endure suffering without being consumed by it. If life has meaning, he reasoned, then even suffering has meaning. And if suffering has meaning, it can be endured. The camp was a living contradiction of this idea. Each day tested it in ways that words can barely capture. Yet time after time, Frankl returned to that inner space, that quiet place where no guard could follow. It was there that he found freedom, not the freedom to escape the camp, but the freedom to escape the prison of despair. His insight would later form the heart of his book, Man's Search for Meaning, a work that would inspire millions. But in those frozen mornings, standing among the skeletal figures in striped uniforms, Frankl was not thinking about literary fame. He was thinking about survival, about keeping his soul intact in a place designed to break it. On a gray morning in the camp, the wind cutting like a blade, Frankl stood in line for roll call. His breath rose in pale clouds, his stomach cramped with hunger. Around him, men swayed in exhaustion, their eyes dull. Somewhere in the distance, a guard barked orders. Frankl closed his eyes and for a moment saw himself walking the streets of Vienna again, the golden light of late afternoon on the cobblestones. He opened them to find himself still in the line, still in the cold, but with a small, unshakable ember inside him. It was the ember of choice, and it burned quietly, defiantly, against the dark.
Before the war and the camps, Viktor Frankl's life was shaped by the vibrant intellectual heartbeat of Vienna in the early 20th century. Born in 1905, he grew up in a city that was a crossroads of culture, science, and philosophy. Sigmund Freud was pioneering psychoanalysis. Alfred Adler was shaping individual psychology, and the cafes of Vienna were alive with discussion, debate, and the exchange of bold ideas. Young Viktor, the middle child in a modest but deeply supportive Jewish family, found himself drawn not to the light amusements of youth, but to the heavy, unshakable questions of existence. By the age of 16, Frankl had already delivered his first public lecture on the meaning of life. While his classmates were concerned with grades or social events, Frankl wrestled with the paradoxes of suffering and the human will to endure. Why do we persist in living when life feels unbearable? What is the invisible thread that keeps us tethered to existence when everything around us falls apart? His academic brilliance carried him into the University of Vienna's medical program, where he specialized in psychiatry and neurology. Frankl admired Freud's pioneering insights, but felt psychoanalysis was too focused on the past. He appreciated Adler's emphasis on community and belonging, but found it insufficient. He began to chart his own course, a therapeutic approach rooted in the belief that meaning was the primary human motivation. In time, this would become logotherapy, a therapy of meaning, from the Greek logos, reason or purpose. Frankl's compassion was not an abstract virtue. Still a medical student, he established free counseling centers for young people struggling with depression and suicidal thoughts. The world was still recovering from the trauma of the First World War, and the Great Depression had left deep emotional scars. In 1931, during one of Vienna's worst periods of economic hardship, not a single suicide was reported among the students who came through Frankl's program, a remarkable achievement that reflected his conviction that life, even in the bleakest of moments, could be infused with purpose. By the mid-1930s, Frankl's reputation had grown. He became head of the neurology department at the Rothschild Hospital, the only hospital in Vienna still permitted to treat Jewish patients after the Nazi rise to power. His work was both medical and moral, helping people not only manage their illnesses, but also confront the dehumanizing effects of discrimination. Then came 1941, and with it, an impossible choice. Frankl had secured a visa to the United States. Acceptance would mean freedom, safety, and the opportunity to continue his career. But leaving would mean abandoning his aging parents, who were unable to emigrate. He visited Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, seeking clarity. In the dim light of the church, his eyes were drawn to a small marble fragment on the altar, salvaged from a destroyed synagogue. It bore a single commandment from the Torah: "Honor thy father and thy mother." He took it as a sign. He tore up the visa. He would stay. That act of devotion sealed his fate. In 1942, Frankl, his wife Tilly, and his parents were deported to Theresienstadt. The camp, used by the Nazis for propaganda, allowed some cultural and educational activities, but behind the staged images lay hunger, disease, and despair. Frankl continued his medical work there, tending to fellow prisoners and offering what psychological support he could. But the safety was an illusion. In 1944, the family was transported to Auschwitz. Upon arrival, Frankl was separated from his parents. He would later learn that both were murdered. His beloved Tilly was sent to Bergen-Belsen, where she would die before the war's end. In the space of days, his entire world collapsed. And yet, in that abyss, the seed of his philosophy remained alive. He had long believed that life's meaning was not something to be given to us, but something we must discover, especially when life offers only suffering. Now, in the crucible of Auschwitz, he would test that belief not as a theory, but as a lifeline. Frankl began to observe his fellow prisoners closely. He noted that survival was not solely dependent on physical strength or health. Some of the strongest men perished quickly, while others, seemingly frail, endured. The difference was often invisible, a will anchored to meaning. For some, it was the thought of loved ones. For others, the belief that they had a task yet to complete. This was the beginning of Frankl's clearest realization, that life asks something of us even in the worst of times. The question is not, what do I expect from life, but what does life expect from me? That inversion of perspective would become the cornerstone of his work. As the days in Auschwitz bled into each other, cold mornings, brutal labor, endless roll calls, Frankl kept returning to that question. Life expected him to survive, to bear witness, to turn his suffering into a lesson that could save others. He could not save his parents, his wife, or the thousands dying around him, but he could preserve the one freedom no one could take away, the freedom to choose his attitude. The war would drag on for months. Frankl's body would weaken, but his determination to live with purpose only grew stronger. The theory he had begun to shape in the bright lecture halls of Vienna was now being refined in a place designed to crush the human soul.
By the winter of 1944, Viktor Frankl had been imprisoned for more than 2 years. The initial shock of camp life had been replaced by a slow, grinding erosion of the body and spirit. Hunger was constant. Cold seeped into the bones. Each day was stripped to the bare mechanics of survival. But for Frankl, survival was not simply about keeping his body alive. It was about protecting the last inner space where meaning could still exist. Mornings began in darkness. Prisoners stumbled from overcrowded wooden barracks, their clogs slipping on ice, their striped uniforms clinging to their frail bodies. They lined up in formation for roll call, the wind slicing through the air. Sometimes the count dragged on for hours. Men collapsed where they stood. The dead were carried away in silence. After roll call came the labor.
It was never work with purpose. It was work designed to exhaust, to break. Prisoners hauled heavy stones, dug trenches in frozen earth, laid railway tracks that would later be dismantled and moved for no reason other than cruelty. The Nazis did not merely seek to destroy lives, they sought to crush the will to live. Frankl began to notice something remarkable. Two men could be given the same ration of bread, face the same freezing temperatures, endure the same brutal orders, and yet one would wither, while the other held on. The difference was not physical strength, it was meaning. Those who had a why to live for, he realized, could bear almost any how. For Frankl, one of those whys was his wife, Tilly. He did not know if she was still alive, but in his mind she was as present as if she stood beside him. One morning, as he marched to a work site through falling snow, he found himself lost in silent conversation with her. The barking of guards and the shuffle of boots faded away. He saw her face clearly, felt her warmth, heard her voice. In that moment he understood that love is not bound by presence or absence. It is the ultimate and highest goal to which man can aspire. He would later write, "The salvation of man is through love and in love." Even if he never saw Tilly again, the act of loving her gave his life meaning. And in the camp, meaning was a lifeline. Another anchor for Frankl was his identity as a doctor. Whenever possible, he tended to sick prisoners despite having almost no medical supplies. Sometimes all he could offer was a few words, an attentive ear, or the brief comfort of human connection. In a place where people were reduced to numbers, being seen and heard reminded them of their humanity. He remembered one prisoner who told him he could not go on. His family was gone, his work destroyed, his body failing. Frankl did not offer false hope. Instead, he asked, "What is life asking of you now?" After a long pause, the man spoke of his child living abroad, waiting for news. The thought of his son expecting him to return became the reason he survived a little longer. Frankl's conviction grew stronger. Life always has meaning, even in suffering, and sometimes especially in suffering. The task is to find it. That meant not asking, "Why is this happening to me?" but "What can I do with this?" But the camp tested this belief every day. In the winter of 1945, Frankl and a group of prisoners were ordered to lay railway tracks in the snow. Their hands cracked and bled from the cold. Frost clung to their faces, and the guards shouted for them to work faster. At one point, Frankl felt himself detach from the scene, as if he were an observer watching his own body work. That detachment was not escape, it was survival. It allowed him to see that while his body was in the camp, his mind could remain free. This became the essence of his philosophy. Suffering in itself is meaningless. We give it meaning by the way we respond. The last and greatest of human freedoms is to choose one's own attitude in any set of circumstances. Even in the final desperate months, when rations were cut to almost nothing, when disease spread without mercy, when rumors of mass executions whispered through the camp, Frankl clung to that freedom. He could not control the guards, the hunger, or the cold, but he could control how he faced them. He could still choose to love, to hope, to see purpose. And then, almost without warning, it was over. In April 1945, the camp gates opened. The guards had fled. Liberation came not with a triumphant roar, but with a quiet, almost eerie stillness. Frankl stepped outside the wire, free again, but into a world that was unrecognizable. His parents were gone. His wife was gone. Everything familiar had been taken from him. And yet he carried with him the one thing the camp could not destroy, the knowledge that even in the worst conditions imaginable, man has the power to decide whether he will surrender to circumstances or not. Liberation, for Viktor Frankl, was not the sudden eruption of joy that many might imagine. It was April 1945 when the camp gates swung open and the SS guards had fled. The prisoners, skeletal and hollow-eyed, stepped hesitantly into the world beyond the barbed wire. There was no cheering, no triumphant embrace, only the eerie quiet of people too starved, too broken to celebrate. Frankl walked past the watchtowers that had defined his horizon for years, past the lifeless forms of those who had not made it to see this day. Outside the camp, the land was eerily still. Nature seemed indifferent to human suffering. The spring grass grew green over fields that had been soaked in blood. In those first hours of freedom, he felt both weightless and disoriented. For years, his life had been reduced to a strict rhythm of commands, suffering, and survival. Now the structure was gone. The chains had fallen away, but so too had the walls that shielded him from the enormity of his loss. Frankl soon learned the truth he had feared. His parents, his brother, and his beloved wife, Tilly, had all perished. The hope that had sustained him, imagining Tilly's smile, hearing her voice in his mind, was now transformed into an ache so deep it seemed to hollow him from the inside. He wrote later, "The crowning experience of all for the homecoming man is the wonderful feeling that, after all he has suffered, there is nothing he need fear anymore except his own mind." Returning to Vienna, he was confronted by a city that had survived the war but lost its soul. The buildings stood, but the air carried the weight of absence. Old friends were gone. Familiar streets felt foreign. He walked through neighborhoods where laughter once echoed, now replaced by silence. Many survivors wrestled with a gnawing question: why was I spared? The guilt of survival, knowing that others stronger, better, or more deserving had died, was a wound that words could barely touch. For Frankl, this question was sharpened by his training as a psychiatrist. He could see, in stark detail, how trauma reshaped the human mind. And yet, the same conviction that had kept him alive in the camps began to reassert itself. The suffering was real, but so was the responsibility to give it meaning. To surrender to despair now, after all he had endured, would be to let the Nazis claim a final victory over his spirit. Instead, Frankl returned to his work. He resumed his post at the Vienna Polyclinic Hospital, treating patients who were themselves adrift in the post-war void. They came with grief that paralleled his own, with nightmares that refused to fade, with lives that felt stripped of purpose. Frankl listened, not only as a doctor, but as a fellow survivor. He understood that healing was not about erasing pain, but about integrating it into a life that could still be lived. In quiet hours, he began to write. The memories of the camp, the faces of those who had perished, the lessons carved into his mind by suffering, all poured onto the page. At first, he did not intend to publish his story. The writing was a form of therapy, a way of organizing the chaos within. But soon he realized that his experiences were not his own. They belonged to anyone struggling to find meaning in the face of suffering. The manuscript was short, less than 200 pages, but dense with the weight of truth. Frankl described the camps not with sensationalism, but with the clarity of one who had lived through them and refused to let hatred define his memory. He wrote of the moments of grace in the midst of cruelty, a sunset glimpsed through the barbed wire, a shared crust of bread, a conversation that rekindled a will to live. The book was titled Man's Search for Meaning and published in 1946. It was unlike anything the public had read before. This was not just a memoir, it was a guide to survival, not in the physical sense, but in the spiritual. Frankl divided the work into two parts. First, his personal account of life in the camps, Second, an introduction to the psychotherapy he had developed from those experiences, which he called logotherapy. Logotherapy was grounded in the belief that the primary human drive is not pleasure, as Freud suggested, nor power, as Adler supposed, but meaning. Suffering in this view is not to be avoided at all costs, but confronted and transformed into purpose. The reception was immediate and profound. Readers recognized in Frankl's words a validation of their own struggles. Soldiers returning from war, widows mourning lost spouses, people grappling with illness or loss, all found in man's search for meaning a mirror and a map. But Frankl himself remained humble about its impact. He said that if the book could help even one person navigate their own suffering, it would have done its job. Decades later, the book would go on to sell millions of copies and be translated into dozens of languages, touching lives across cultures and generations. Still, for Frankl, the work was never about fame. It was about keeping a promise to the dead, to the living, and to himself that their suffering would not be meaningless.
In the years that followed the publication of Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl became more than a psychiatrist. He became a voice for those who had endured suffering beyond words. Invitations came from universities, conferences, and institutions around the world. He lectured in packed auditoriums, speaking not as a distant scholar, but as a man who had walked through the abyss and returned with a message. His philosophy, logotherapy, was deceptively simple yet profoundly challenging. Life holds meaning under all circumstances, even the most miserable ones. And it is our responsibility, not our privilege, to find that meaning. He taught that we do not ask life for its meaning. Instead, life asks us. Each moment is a question, and our actions are the answer. Frankl's words resonated because they did not come from theory alone. They were forged in the crucible of Auschwitz and Dachau. When he spoke about the freedom to choose one's attitude, he was not offering platitudes. He was recalling the only power left to him when every other freedom had been stripped away. As the decades passed, the world changed. The horrors of the Holocaust became history lessons, and new generations faced different kinds of struggles. Wars of the mind, crises of identity, battles with depression and alienation. Yet Frankl's message remains startlingly relevant. The form of suffering might evolve, but the human need for meaning was timeless. In his lectures, he often told a story about patients who came to him convinced that their lives were over. An elderly man mourning his wife, a young professional crushed by failure. Rather than prescribing quick solutions, Frankl asked them to step back and see their pain from another angle. Could this suffering be turned into an achievement? Could it be a test they could pass with dignity? In reframing the struggle, he gave them the tools to endure. Frankl's approach was not about erasing pain, it was about harnessing it. He insisted that life was not primarily about seeking happiness, but about answering the unique demands of each moment. Happiness, he said, ensues as a byproduct of living a life of meaning, not as a goal in itself. As his reputation grew, so did the reach of his ideas. By the time he passed away in 1997, Viktor Frankl had written more than 30 books, trained countless therapists, and addressed audiences in every corner of the globe. But his greatest legacy was not the books or the lectures. It was the millions of lives quietly altered by his reminder that you are not fully conditioned and determined. No matter the weight of your past or the limitations of your present, you can choose your response. Today, in a world that often feels fragmented and restless, Frankl's insights are perhaps more urgent than ever. Social media, constant comparison, and a culture of instant gratification leave many feeling unmoored.
Anxiety, burnout, and a sense of purposelessness gnaw at the edges of daily life, but Frankl's voice still cuts through the noise. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. His challenge to us is not to deny our suffering, but to rise above it by assigning it meaning. This might mean dedicating ourselves to a cause greater than our own comfort, deepening our relationships, or simply enduring hardship with integrity. Frankl's life was proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, meaning is not extinguished. It waits to be claimed. The camps taught him that two men could stand in the same freezing barracks, enduring the same hunger and abuse, yet live entirely different inner lives, one consumed by bitterness, the other sustained by purpose. As you hear these words, ask yourself, in the face of your own struggles, be they large or small, what is life asking of you? What answer will you give? Because meaning is not found in abstract ideals, but in the concrete choices we make every day. Whether you're comforting a friend, pursuing a dream, or confronting loss, each act can be your reply to life's silent question. Frankl left us with a roadmap, but it is not one with fixed directions. Instead, it is a compass pointing to the truth that meaning is personal, specific, and earned. No one else can live your life for you, and no one else can answer for you the question that only you can hear. Live as if you were living a second time, Frankl advised, and as though you had acted wrongly the first time. This is his enduring invitation, to live deliberately, to choose with courage, to bear suffering with dignity, and never surrender the freedom that remains. So, as we close this journey through Viktor Frankl's life and thought, remember this: circumstances may shape you, but they do not define you. That final choice, how you respond, will always be yours. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of resilience, meaning, and the unbreakable human spirit. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might need it today. And if you want more deep dives into the lives and ideas that can guide us through modern challenges, subscribe to our channel, like this video, and tap the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Together, let's keep searching for meaning.